Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another of our Knauss Fellows presentations. This one is considered a Shark Tank style, and we have 4 presenters today who will be giving brief presentations and then short Q&As after that. As a reminder, we are recording this. If you are having any audio or visual issues, I recommend logging off and logging back in. That usually fixes most problems. And if we don't get to your question today, never fear. We are going to pass those questions on to the presenters if we don't have time for them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Christine Zicane, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you, Katie. Our first speaker is Aaron. Aaron is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications Knauss Fellow. He's just received his PhD in marine science from the University of South Alabama, studying ecosystem services or service shifts with coastal wetland migration. And shortly before the fellowship, he was coordinating the NIS funding extension project in the coastal Mississippi aimed at improving environmental and scientific literacy through place-based education of living shorelines. In his current role, he's forwarding and biotechnology and data management initiatives.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the Fish and Wildlife's large initiatives to revolutionize their data management strategy, which is a large initiative of many organizations nowadays for the emerging field of, not emerging field, but like exploding field of data science. So the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants in their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. And so in 2015, following significant legislation, including the Open Data Act and FOIA, for example, to promote transparency, Fish and Wildlife is really running with that and taking advantage of this opportunity to that the organization and merging of these data sets, for example, can really forward our scientific initiatives, as well as some of our the conservation inevitable things that follow from that. So in 2015, we held a workshop that was focused on data resources, and what came of that was a tagline that scientific data are trust resources and the foundation of our future conservation actions. So there, we got ecosystems and information systems, and they're not necessarily one-to-one relationships. There's many different socioeconomical, political categorization, how we organize things. So with the Fish and Wildlife, you can see in the bottom right, our organization chart, they're separated by programs, they're separated by regions, and the regions themselves have been mixed up a bit. So now it's not even that, it's not even the current structure. Now we've got these unified interior things. And so each of those groupings aren't necessarily aligned with how ecosystems function and how data sets might align with that. And so kind of our existing technology, which is composed entirely within this Fish and Wildlife Services quote unquote data lake, or a systems list of just all the different types of data that exist currently and how that's all currently organized. And it's not the best. It's a start, and inevitably this is, you know, where all this technology is constantly emerging. So we're trying to capitalize upon that to ultimately optimize our needs for the conservation mission. So currently we have ServCat, which is just mostly just a cataloging system, not necessarily accessible for our data sets. And so we merge that with other tools and resources that are available to meet our needs. Oh, and also data.gov ultimately is the final repository for many of these things, but there's many like working, more time-sensitive factors that we're also engaged with. So some of the major challenges that were identified back in 2015 were the cultures of the fish and wildlife and the scientific community of the natural sciences. Most of our capacity, our personality have this mentality of kind of boots on the ground, which is great, but you know, as needs have changed and we've had technology capacities, the focus has been more on this data science and these shifting needs towards data science to address that capacity need. And so, and there's also publications and those kind of reformats, like the USGS used to be a part of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and now a lot of those scientific initiatives and capacity is shifted to them. We retain some, but publications aren't necessarily our focus. So lacking that, like that affects how we work with our data. Also, there's just an incidental like organizational structure, getting it back at the previous slide. And that's kind of a worldwide challenge where we've got these incredible systems and all these different segmentations and trying to address like how data sets are arranged and what we have access to ultimately forward particular initiatives, and as those priorities change as well as new science develops. And so a lot of science that we have is stored in these legacy files on floppy disks, on USBs, on files somewhere. People retire. So how do we address those challenges going forward? And finally, this commitment to resources and commitment and these resources that are needed. And so as our needs change, so do our commitments and our resources. And so there's inevitably trade-offs. And if there was any eternal lyric that stuck around, times are changing. So how do we address this? What does quality data look like? Quality data management. There's a number of these types of little diagrams that exist for kind of an overarching system. And so this is the one that the Fish and Wildlife System has adopted. And so you've got 6 stages that involve the planning stage, the acquire section, the maintenance, access, and evaluation, and finally, ultimately archiving that stuff, which is different from access, I might add. So each one of those steps, planning, you've got to address every single one of these things. How is this data going to be, what's the purpose of collecting all this data, and how are we going to do that? So standardizing how it merges with other groups. How does it maintain? How do things change as these data continue to be acquired? And then once is it accessible to everyone? Legislation requires that stuff. So how do we provide that in open formats, machine readable, and meet the needs of the American people? And evaluation, inevitably, just going back over the steps. Is this working for our needs? And amidst control, ultimately go to the pristine archive. So how are we getting there? This is all very fast moving, and because the needs are sudden, we're trying to address basically everything at once, which is pretty incredible effort. And it wasn't until just last year, and there's 9 boxes down here, but I can put my screen over here. It wasn't until last year that we actually appointed our chief data officer. Only recently before established a data governance board that currently lead these efforts. But until then, it was largely based upon the recognized need of everyone involved. So we established a data science committee, as well as a community of practice. So the community of practice, everyone's kind of interested in this as far as the Fish and Wildlife is concerned. And the data science committee is anybody that just has data science affiliations and resources, expertise that Fish and Wildlife can exchange ideas with. And we're trying to improve upon our trainings and our hirings to improve capacity. And amidst all this, there's a strategy and vision that's coming out. We're rewriting our basic policies as well as the standards and how standards are put forth. Communication platforms are critical. I know NOAA, for example, is doing a number of different tools and merging these things in similar parallel interests. Ultimately devising like templates for data management that service the entire system. For folks who aren't necessarily familiar with data management, this provides a baseline template to work with and learn about these things. And in guidance towards that, a handbook, of course, and then repositories, interfaces that are user-friendly and considerate of optimizing our available resources going forward. And amidst this, Fish and Wildlife prides itself in a 2-way approach. So you've got the enterprise programmatic needs, which involves, the big data, the merging data sets, connecting large initiatives, summarizing to justify funding to legislators, for example. But from the field input, it needs to be practical. We got to address the logistics, the feasibility, the resource needs, the training, and getting feedback from them regarding all of those things. Oh, I will spend anything for those two. So ultimately, the strategy going forward at this point, which is going forward, we've got communications, we have cultural transformation, the technical infrastructure that can accommodate these things, tools and resources, not just just cataloging what's out there, but in the editor, that we have good metadata that can allow us to access and search and use that data on bigger scale initiatives. And we also team up still with our old partners, USGS, among many others. That is in our mission statement, is to working with others to really leverage other people's resources, as well as providing our own and really optimize our initiatives. And ultimately, governance is the guiding light amidst all this and keeping us on track going forward. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll end with kind of my involvement has largely been addressing that cultural aspect, and so putting together all these data success stories to really hopefully motivate what folks realize are possible, because this is a difficult change. There's a shift in mentality, and so I recommend to anyone that's watching within Fish and Wildlife Service that they check out these success stories, they seek training, sign up for the community of practice, getting involved with these discussions, that they can bring in their own input and join the discussion and really contribute to how we go forward. as well as communicate with the data science expertise. This is the way of the future. And then ultimately discovering efficiencies in your own process, because we're seeing folks who've been on the field for a long time and realizing like, oh, this can actually be made so much more easier by just a semi-automatic process using R, that like we actually don't have to spend so much time analyzing, going through Excel. Like there's just like plug and chug basically, and you can actually spend more time outdoors. Because I myself, I love being out in the field too, and realizing this coming into science, like there's a lot more time at the desk, but ultimately this is what's important to move conservation initiatives forward, and so that even in my off hours I can really enjoy those times. So I'll end with our chief data officer's a standing quote that our legacy in working with these data is, legacy is your data, and that's what stands the test of time and ultimately contributes to our overall initiative. So with that, I thank everyone for their attention and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Okay, so if you do have a question, please place that in the question panel and I will be reading those off for our speakers. If you think of a question later and you didn't ask it, no worries, just throw that in the question panel and we will get all of these gathered up at the end and share them with the speakers. Right now, Aaron, I'm not seeing any questions. Doesn't mean people don't have it, but I'm going to move us along to our next. Oh, actually, we do have a question, and I think we have time, so I'm going to ask it. Aaron, can you please share one typical success story?
Typical success story. A big one was the Fish and Wildlife Service. We switched over from Google. It really synced really nice with NOAA and many of our partners, and we switched over to Teams and the Office 365 Outlook. I know other agencies are dealing with this kind of transition too, but like shifting over all that data and backups and stuff like that. Many of our partners, and we have these security concerns. So in within a couple months, we had these guidebooks put together of someone who had compiled all these like routes and guidance for how to share data with other partners, and really that communications element to this going forward. So that would be a big one I would point to maybe.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we are going to move to our next speaker.
Great. So our next speaker is Josie. Josie is a Knauss Marine Policy Fellow placed as a Congressional Affairs Specialist with NOAA Research. She received her Master's of Science last summer in Ecology and Conservation from Bowling Green State University, where she studied the links between aquatic and freshwater ecosystems. For her master's research, she performed a greenhouse study on soil nutrient cycling and the impact of detrivore abundance on soil and runoff nutrients. In her current role, Josie contributes to policymaking for NOAA Research, and she also manages congressional relations between the Hill and the OAR scientists, labs, and programs.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming today. My name is Josie Lindsey-Robbins, and I'm a Knauss Fellow this year with NOAA Research. When I first applied to Knauss, I knew that I wanted an experience linking science communication with the development of policy. I spent most of my master's in the field, literally. I studied agricultural ecology and soil science in grad school. For my project, I had to talk with farmers about their crops and their soil, and about their management practices they were using to maintain them. Through those conversations, I realized there was a lack of understanding of how science is incorporated into policy on both sides. It turns out much of the science gets lost in translation. Little did I know that I would be placed as a Congressional Affairs Specialist with NOAA Research, where I am now the middleman, or I guess woman, between NOAA scientists and lawmakers on the Hill. So who do I work with? I am a part of a team called CARD, which is part of OAR's Chief Financial Office staff. If you know our acronym, then you know what we do. The C is for Congressional. We're responsible for facilitating and coordinating all facets of OAR's interactions with Congress. Our goal is to represent OAR's science accurately and authentically on the Hill and with other constituents. The A is for Analysis. One of the most important parts of our job is keeping tabs on the pulse of Congress. What do they want? Who wants it? How are they going to get it? And what relationships or connections are forming between offices, and how does that impact our strategy? This essentially boils down to tracking legislation and other congressional actions and attending hearings and briefings that are relevant to OAR. Once we have all this information, we can reach out to our labs and programs to make sure everyone is on board and informed on what's happening on the Hill. The R is for relations. Not only do we analyze and track Hill activity, but we're responsible for cultivating strong relations with members of Congress so that they trust NOAA and see the importance of our labs and programs. This is probably the bulk of our job, and it includes planning, preparing, and executing Hill briefings and hearings, as well as including all the testimony and written material that goes along with that. We also facilitate interactions between subject matter experts and OAR and congressional staff. And this includes preparing scientists and senior management for briefings and hearings, managing all the follow-up requests from those meetings, and arranging answers for congressional inquiries. And last, the D is for division. CARD is just 1/4 of the formulation and congressional analysis team within NOAA Research. We also work with a policy team, a budget team, and a strategic management team. By working together, we're able to track Congress, create policy-focused weather, ocean, and climate research, policy focused on weather, ocean, and climate research, as well as manage our budget, which helps us to create feasible strategic plans to reach our mission. But who do we work with on the Hill? CARD works with the NOAA Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs to communicate with the members of Congress and their staff, as well as congressional committees. This basically includes any district or state that we do research in, as well as our authorizing and appropriating committees. A few of our authorizing committees include House Science, Space, and Technology, House Natural Resources, and the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation committees. Our appropriating committees are House and Senate appropriations. Why is what we do important to you? Part of OAR's mission is to transition research results so they are useful for society. One way of transitioning research results out of academic journals and into the real world is helping our scientists to inform policy. We pass along the data and results from scientists to the people who are writing the actual policy, letting our scientists have a say in what is written. This usually results in laws and regulations that are scientifically supported and more useful to the stakeholders that are actually impacted by those laws. But why should you care? You should care because we actually get to help real people, even if it is a little bit indirectly. OAR's labs and programs are performing experiments every day and managing projects with an end goal of making something somewhere better. Whether it's making severe weather forecasts more accurate or improving coastal resilience through climate change data, NOAA research is important to real people with real lives. CARD hopes that by coordinating relations between scientists and lawmakers, we can help create useful policies and initiatives that not only advance our mission, but put our research to work for you. Thank you all for listening today, and I'm happy to take any questions if we have some time.
Thanks so much, Josie. Same thing to our audience. If you have questions, please place them in the question panel. And if you don't, or if you think of something later, put it in the question panel and we will grab it later. Gonna give everyone another minute to think about their questions. I don't have anything in the question panel yet, Josie.
Alrighty.
Okay, we do have a question. What has been your favorite briefing or legislation you have worked on during your fellowship?
I have to say that the only briefings that I was able to go to in person before the whole pandemic are probably my favorite, just because they were in person. I was able to help out with the Great Lakes Days on the Hill, where we took different people from GLERL and NOS and a couple other offices up to the Hill to meet with a series of members of Congress. And that was a really awesome way to be introduced to this office. You know, I got to see exactly what we were doing. And of course, I didn't really know what I was doing and how to help out with that, but it was still really cool to see. And I get to look back on that now and say, yep, that was the one briefing that I got to go to in person.
Nice. We do have another question. What is the most complicated science you've had to communicate so far?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that there was some questions that we got on Congressional inquiry about buoys and measuring sound through the ocean. And I am not a marine scientist. I studied soil. And so it was something that I had no idea how to answer. And I actually had to go to Anne and ask, what is this acronym? What does this mean? Because it was about some stuff that GOMO worked on in ocean observations. And we had to have a few different meetings, translating what the scientists meant into words that would make sense for the Hill staffers. And it was a really cool process, but it is literally like translating another language.
And we're going to grab one more question. Does CARD advocate for all NOAA line offices or just OAR specific? Can employees from other line offices join CARD or become involved?
That's a really good question. So CARD is specific for OAR. I believe every line office has a congressional team, or at least someone who is fielding congressional inquiries. And I believe that you could probably contact NOAA Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs to figure out who within your line office is best for that. But we do coordinate with other line offices a lot. Like I just had a briefing right before this talk where I coordinated with NIMS and NOS. So depending on what the briefing or the topic is, we do work with other line offices occasionally.
Thank you. We did have one last question sneak in, and I'm going to allow it. What is the most unexpected aspect of your role?
I think one of the unexpected aspects of my role is that there's a difference between policy and politics. And I think in our position, it is it can be kind of hard to differentiate between policy and politics. And we have to know about the politics in order to do our job correctly, right? Part of our job is to know who wants what and how are they going to get it. And a lot of that's negotiations that happen on the Hill. And we have to know, the intentions behind a lot of those negotiations that are going on in order to pass bills or make changes to bills. And so that was something that was pretty surprising to me, and I'm still learning.
Great, thank you. Okay, we are going to move on to our next speaker.
Yes, our next speaker is Jasmine. She finished her Master's of Science in Aquatic Toxicology at Washington State University, where her research focused on identifying the threat of urban stormwater runoff to local salmon populations. This work led her to realize that the importance of developing, adjusting, and enforcing relevant policy as new research is published in order to effectively protect threatened fisheries. Her Knauss placement in NOAA Fisheries Office of Law Enforcement has allowed her to learn about the process of developing and implementing international fisheries policy.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone listening in. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to tell you very briefly a little bit about my thesis research from Washington State University, assessing Coho salmon sensitivity to urban stormwater runoff, and to convince you that it is an important issue that everyone should be aware of and paying attention to. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about how this issue of salmon sensitivity to stormwater was discovered. And the setting of this story is urban streams in the Seattle area. So in the 1990s, the city of Seattle funded a lot of restoration work on urban streams. And one of the goals of this work was to increase the habitat for salmon spawning. After this restoration was completed, there was a series of post-project effectiveness monitoring, which was basically looking to see whether or not salmon did in fact come in and use the new habitat. And they discovered that fish were coming in, which sounds exciting. However, there was an odd behavior that was soon recognized in the adult coho spawners. I'm going to attempt to show you a video of how this looked. So here we have an obviously sick fish. We can see erratic surface swimming, gaping, fin splaying, a loss of equilibrium, and the stream monitors were finding that these fish were dying prematurely, full of eggs, indicating that they were unable to successfully spawn. And understandably, this caused a lot of questions and concerns about what was killing the coho, especially after all this work had gone in order to help protect the species. And so my advisor, Jennifer McIntyre, and several researchers at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center were among those that sought to find some answers. And they conducted an 8-year-long investigative study that I'm going to boil down to 2 bullet points. And basically, they learned that the recurrent die-offs of the coho spawners were unique to urban streams. They were, this pre-spawn mortality was occurring at rates of about 90% in urban streams compared to about 1% in rural streams. And they also, in their studies, looked for factors that could help to explain causes of the die-offs. And the only factors that were associated with these mortality rates were evidence of exposures to metals and petroleum hydrocarbons. And this suggested an exposure to urban stormwater runoff. And they were able to recreate the same suite of behaviors and acute mortality observed in the streams by experimentally exposing coho to urban stormwater runoff. And this is where my lab research comes in. So I divided up the questions that my lab addresses into these 3 areas. One is assessing the threat of stormwater, which is what my thesis research focused on. Then there's identifying the causes of the threat. And this was really looking into what sources of stormwater runoff the fish were sensitive to and responding to. And then lastly, what can we do about this? What solutions exist? For those of you who have not seen stormwater, I wanted to include this photo of our collection site at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. And if there's one thing I want you all to take away from this quick talk, it is my professional assessment that stormwater is gross. And it is a chemical cocktail that is just getting swept away into our water system every time it rains. And looking at this stormwater, it's really not hard to put together why we're seeing these toxic impacts. However, my research was acknowledging the fact that the stormwater we collect directly off of the downspouts of highways is not equivalent to the stormwater exposures that the salmon are experiencing in the streams, right? They are experiencing dilutions and they are experiencing different pulses of stormwater depending on the conditions of the storm. So my work was the first attempt at assessing coho sensitivity in more realistic exposure scenarios. And I could spend hours talking about the details of that study, but I'm going to boil it down to one graph. So this graph is showing a dilution study where we have percent mortality on the y-axis and different dilutions of stormwater runoff on the x-axis. And we're comparing 3 different storm events. And I, again, could talk about this for some time, but I'm going to direct your attention to one point, which is 2.2% stormwater. This is the amount of stormwater that the fish could handle, the coho, without experiencing any mortality in any of the replications in any of the storms, which is saying that the coho require 97.8% clear, clean, pristine water in order to completely avoid mortality, which is, and it's just demonstrating how sensitive they are to stormwater runoff and to whatever chemical specifically in stormwater runoff that is causing these impacts. Very briefly, I wanted to touch on causes of the threat. I worked with some chemists at the University of Washington, Tacoma. I'm not a chemist, so please don't ask me chemist questions, but I helped to work with them to identify a line of evidence that's really pointing to tires as the likely source within stormwater runoff, containing what I think of as the chemical culprit that salmon are responding so severely to. And we have a paper under review at Science, so fingers crossed, that details the steps we took in order to identify the specific suite of chemicals that the fish are sensitive to. And lastly, I wanted to end on a happier note of solutions. What can we do? Tires are ubiquitous, stormwater is ubiquitous. How can we go about cleaning up our waterways from the toxic impacts of stormwater? And we have demonstrated in several studies that a simple soil column is effective at filtering out the harmful toxicants in stormwater runoff. And there's ongoing research to identify questions about the longevity of the filtration capabilities of these soil columns and what other properties may assist in the efficiency of the filtration columns. And of course, then we enter questions about installation and getting this to become just managed on a more broader level than it is currently. With that, I want to thank all of the research partners that were involved in this work and continue to be involved in this work. And I welcome any questions either now or via email.
Great, thanks so much, Jasmine. We do have a few questions and I'm gonna hop on this first one here. Would volunteer water quality testing labs be beneficial to achieve the desired outcomes?
Yeah, so we have involved citizen science in this work in the past. We were, for now, what we did was we trained people on what to look for in order to identify this pre-spawn mortality syndrome and asked people to send in videos if they saw a sick fish so that we could understand more about the breadth of where this syndrome was occurring in Puget Sound. And that was very helpful, and we got a lot of participation. And the chemists at University of Washington Tacoma do go out and do field studies. So we have the glamorous work of running out into storms during storm events and sampling the storm water in the streams. And that's work that they specifically are doing. And I'm not sure if the Citizen Science Project has been expanded to include that work. I'm not sure if it would have the same level of participation enthusiasm as, you know, walking down a stream and happening to see some salmon. But I think it would certainly help the research and may or may not be currently implemented. I wasn't directly involved in the citizen science development of the project, but yes, in general, keeping track of the stormwater water quality, especially now that we have more information about the chemicals that are really the fish are responding to, I see as being a potential useful way forward.
All right, thank you. Our next question, how can other areas of the country identify and reduce the impact of stormwater runoff?
There's a lot of research that exists already. Everyone can do simple things like not washing their car in their own driveway, going to an actual car wash station where they have filtration systems in place in order to capture all of those chemicals that are washed off of your car. Because, you know, every time you are driving, every time you are building up chemicals on your car and it rains, that will automatically contribute to the stormwater. So there are things like installing rain gardens, installing soil columns in under your storm drain at home. Lots of options exist on a personal level that you can implement. And tracking and supporting the research, of course, if it's not an area you're directly involved in, is, you know, bringing awareness and doing what you can to help support us working towards getting actual better management strategies in place for stormwater.
Great. We have another question. What's the, excuse me, what's the spatial extent of this effect? Is it widespread across heavily vegetated areas too?
No, so there is a direct gradient according to urbanization. So the more rural you get, the more vegetation you're around, the less traffic and road density and impermeable surfaces that are around, the less instances of this pre-spawn mortality are recognized. And there is research from the lab kind of that details this urban gradient that's been recognized. So again, the picture I have up right now of downtown Seattle, this is far from a forest. This is a very typical example of an urban city where you just don't have that filtration capabilities that are natural in a forest ecosystem, where that soil, where the stormwater is able to permeate into the ground and be filtered out. So to give you a long answer, no, the further away we get from a forest, the more pervasive the pre-spawn mortality syndrome is.
Great, thank you. I'm going to grab one more question, and there are a few others that I may pass on to you after this. But you mentioned tires as being a factor. One of our listeners is saying tires are recycled as road construction materials, and do you think this contributes to urban runoff pollution?
Yes. You know, there are actually, the more we worked with the chemists, and again, I'm not a chemist, but there is a lot of overlap in the different sources that we looked into. And I definitely think if tires are recycled all over the place. I mean, they're used in artificial reefs and things like this. We don't really know what to do with them. We don't really know how to recycle them appropriately. And so definitely anywhere where these chemicals are being introduced into the ecosystem is going to have a compounding impact on the aquatic ecosystem. So I think just a lot of work and research needs to be done, and management experts need to collaborate in order to figure out what do we do with these chemicals, because every time you get your tires changed, you are reintroducing new chemicals. It's an acknowledgement, I guess, of the way that you have released chemicals into the ecosystem. So we just definitely need a better solution about how to manage these chemicals and keep them out of the system.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. We are going to move on to our next speaker, and whatever questions we didn't get to, we will pass those on after the event or if we have time after the last presentation.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Emily. Emily is a 2020 Knauss Fellow who recently obtained her PhD in Integrative Conservation and Anthropology from the University of Georgia and currently serves as a partnership specialist with NOAA National Sea Grant Office. In this role, Emily builds upon international collaborative experiences, including as a Fulbright scholar in Brazil and the Peace Corps, environmental educator, and nonprofit photographer in Paraguay. Whether in her doctoral or partnership work, Emily enjoys engaging multiple stakeholders to address socio-ecological challenges in a collaborative, interdisciplinary, creative, and inclusive manner.
Hi, can you see my screen okay now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Hey everyone, my name is Emily Horton and I'm a partnership specialist and a Knauss Fellow with the National Sea Grant Office, and it's a pleasure to be presenting to you all, so thank you for joining. Today I'm going to briefly share with you how I engaged photography as a research and communications tool to disseminate study findings and inform marine policy discussions while doing my doctoral fieldwork in a co-managed marine protected area in Brazil. My PhD, which I just finished, was in anthropology and integrative conservation from the University of Georgia. Basically, I specialize in understanding the human and sociocultural dimensions of marine conservation and policy. So co-management brings together multiple stakeholders across jurisdictional levels, ranging from the local to federal. Knowledge held by actors at the local level can feed back into higher level discussions related to marine resource management. However, blockages in information flow across levels can result in state policies that are mismatched with localized knowledge and socioecological dynamics. My research centered on a small-scale fishing ban in a co-managed marine protected area called Marine Extractive Reserve Cururupu. The reserve is located along the coast of Maranhão State in northeastern Brazil. Local communities critique the 3-month fishing ban for its negative livelihood and food security impacts. For example, they reported that the ban occurs during peak shrimp harvest season, and it is thus especially detrimental to their shrimp-dependent income. They also pointed out the ecological ineffectiveness of the ban, noting that the fish species the ban aims to protect, the Atlantic anchoveta, often shows up in large quantities prior to the ban period. To understand points of contention, I carried out 13 months of fieldwork in the reserve on a small island, drawing from the social and ecological sciences as well as the visual arts to ask how the ban aligns with localized socioecological dynamics. Here, I focus on the visual component of my research, which employed participatory and documentary photography to ask how this fishery system and the fishing ban shape local well-being. This visual approach generated very rich qualitative data, providing more personalized and localized understanding of the fishery system and the ban. In addition to photography serving as a research method, the resulting images from this process also served 2 key purposes: to disseminate study findings and inform policy discussions. With the support of local communities and a small Kickstarter grant to supplement my Fulbright one, images were used to create community photography exhibits and field sites with the aim of disseminating research results in a more inclusive and engaging manner. After the photo exhibits, the images displayed were converted into photo booklets to remain and be accessible to the communities. This was a somewhat improvised and shoestring budget project, but it is one that I'm proud of, and I hope that as researchers we can move towards thinking about how we can make sure that the research that we're doing is getting fed back into the local communities who are providing the baseline data for this research, and really making sure their voices are appreciated and that they're getting that feedback loop to see the results of some of their research. Images generated through this study were also used to inform marine policy discussions. During fieldwork, I left the island to travel to the capital for a week to collaborate with the federal agency ICMBio, who oversees the reserve. During this time, I prepared a report which employed study photos alongside qualitative and quantitative findings to communicate research to policymakers and inform discussions on the fishing ban, particularly in a way that eliminated localized socioecological dynamics. In a small way, this was an effort to help bridge some of the informational disconnect that can arise in code management between localized knowledge and marine policy crafted at higher jurisdictional levels that can impact communities' well-being and ecological outcomes. So that is a summary of this brief presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions here, or please feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. We have our first question. Dr. Horton, have you explored the data collection aspects of photography? Did any locals own smartphones with cameras? Were any of them interested in citizen science activities?
That is a wonderful question. I didn't get that far along with exploring those myriad options. I think there are definitely examples out there of really neat ways to try and engage photography in a citizen science format to have people participate. I think one of the first things that's so important, especially in thinking about even bringing in photography as an aspect into one's research, is really making sure that it's addressing a need that's socioculturally sensitive, and then thinking about that technological landscape. On the island where I lived, we didn't have a consistent like electricity and internet connection, all these different things. So the way I did it was we just had kind of community cameras, a couple of them that I had bought as part of my fieldwork funds, and provided some training on how to use those. People were versed in their cell phones, but we just weren't at that point in our project to try and manage all the photos people were taking their cell phones. So we just stuck to 2 simple cameras that we shared, and I kind of managed the data. With that said, I'd be happy to talk more with anyone who's interested in brainstorming or reflecting on how they might engage photography to the degree it's appropriate, who's working with communities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I am not seeing any other questions right now, but if anyone has anything they would like to ask about any from any of our speakers, now is the time to put those in the question panel. I'm gonna give everyone a minute to do that. Okay, I'm not seeing any extra questions. Do any of this, oh. No. Sorry, no more questions that I'm seeing right now on your topic, Emily. Okay. Anne, did you want to say anything last minute, or did any of the speakers want to hop on with any last minute comments?
No, I just wanted to thank the presenters again for putting themselves out there and giving such great presentations.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the speakers. These were all wonderful presentations. Just a reminder, we did record this, so every snippet, every presentation will be on the library's YouTube channel, and you can pass these on to colleagues or come back to them if you missed one of the presentations. And with that, I'm going to give everyone back about 10 minutes of their day. And if we didn't get to your question, I will be passing those on to the speakers. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.